We have spoken over the last few days about the issues of emancipation of serfs or slaves, and seen a couple of different ways of doing it, from the French version of emancipation, which set the serfs free and gave them land, to the Americans, who set the slaves free and gave them wishes for good luck, or perhaps the Prussian approach, which set the serfs free and gave them opportunities. Today we look at one more model about how this might be done, or perhaps how not to do it, and that would be in Russia, because Russia also faced issues of emancipation. But they did it a little bit differently than some of the other models that we've talked about. The leader of Russia since the 1820s was Nicholas I. This is the guy who by the 1830s was teaching the lessons of orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationalism. Nicholas was an autocrat, and he faced many challenges, but by the early 18... In particular, Nicholas found this spilling over into a variety of conflicts by the 1850s. One area in particular that was a problem was in the Middle East, where the Orthodox and Catholic churches were rivals over the administration of various holy shrines and who would control them. One that had been a particular difficult spot had been the cathedral in Bethlehem, built over the site of the Nativity. Monks from the Orthodox and Catholic churches both were there and had gotten into such vicious arguments over the administration of the site that they were strangling each other with rosaries on one particular Easter over who was going to open the site and pray there. In 1853, the Ottomans gave control of the Bethlehem Cathedral to the French Catholics, setting off great anger on the part of the Orthodox Church. And it was in a response to that the Russians became involved. This became the pretext for them to declare war on the Ottoman Empire in an effort to defend the honor and privileges of the Orthodox people. It becomes known as the Crimean War. And of course, to a fair degree, this was a pretext over the seizure of other territory belonging to the Ottoman Empire as well, that was really of even greater interest to the Russian government. Specifically, in the case of the Crimean War, the Russians chose to invade, to liberate the Middle East by coming through southeastern Europe and across the Bosphorus and into what would now be modern-day Turkey. In the process, they seized land in the Balkans, and it is that set off others into issues of concern, specifically the British and the French, who had trade interests in Turkey and feared Russian expansion. Britain, of course, still feared the power and the prestige that Russia had enjoyed since the days of the defeat of Napoleon. Louis Napoleon, the new emperor of France, was angry because Nicholas wouldn't even recognize him as the head of the French government. They had agreed in the Congress of Vienna that there would be no more Napoleons, and Louis Napoleon was close enough. The result is that Britain and France gave aid to the Turkish government, and this became the Crimean War. The Crimean War began in 1853. It lasted until 1856. And though Russia did quite well at the beginning of that war, they were unable to sustain the effort. Ultimately, this is a very bloody and nasty little war. About 500,000 people were killed before Russia finally lost the war. But the biggest problem that they faced was that Britain and France had become industrialized. Russia had not. The Industrial Revolution had hit, and Britain and France were able to produce arms. They were able to move troops effectively from one place to another, travel across 1,000 miles to get the troops to the various venues of the Crimean War. Russia was unable to do this. They couldn't produce enough arms to fight. They couldn't get their troops where they needed them. And much of the war actually ended up being fought not in the Ottoman Empire, certainly not in the Middle East, but in the Crimean Peninsula, that little diamond of land that sticks out into the northern part of the Black Sea. And so Russia was fighting as Alexander II. And Alexander II very quickly recognized that he had issues and problems that were being demonstrated by the failure of the Russian government to effectively wage the Crimean War. In particular, it was Alexander who recognized that the failure to industrialize was causing issues for the Russian government and its ability to maintain power. That meant that if industrialization was to occur, reform needed to occur as well. In order to industrialize, the Russians were going to need workers who were motivated and willing to become involved in the process of creating an industrial base in Russia. Furthermore, in order to compete militarily with the powers of the day, the Frances, the Britons, and the Prussians, for example, they were going to need an army, a big army. They were going to need to figure out how to control that, though. And one of the ways you control that army, and one of the ways you minimize the costs of a large, well-armed army, is to use reserves. And so Alexander determined, when the Crimean War ended, that one of his goals, along with industrialization, was to build a large reserve force to support his military. That, on the other hand, poses other issues. Where do you get the manpower to industrialize? Where do you get the manpower to stock the military reserves? Well, Russia had an answer. The answer is 20 million serfs that are living in Russia. But you can't arm and train serfs for the military if they're serfs, if they're slaves, if they're not loyal to Russia. Nor can you relocate them and motivate them to go to work in industrial centers if they're virtual slaves tied to the land. The answer to Alexander was clear. The serfs needed to be emancipated in order to create a loyal, mobile, large force of manpower for the Russian people. And so in February of 1861, Alexander issued an edict emancipating the serfs. This made Russia actually the last European state to do so. Lest we cast too many stones at them, however, that still puts them ahead of the United States by a couple of years, as well as other large nations in the world, such as Brazil, that didn't emancipate their slaves until 1888. When the serfs were emancipated, they were given rights. Limited rights, but some rights nonetheless. For the first time, serfs were allowed to marry as they chose. They were allowed to pursue trades. They were allowed to attend court and defend themselves, and various other rights that had been denied them for the hundreds of years of servitude that they had survived. They also, free men, had to find a way to live, and so they were given land rights. They were given a small parcel of the land which they had been working for generations. And they were free to sell that land, buy more land, or do whatever they wanted. But the problem was that their old landlords, the aristocrats that had owned those serfs and owned that land, were the ones who had to give the land up, and they chose which land to give them. So generally speaking, the serfs did not receive prime agricultural territory. Instead, they received the ravines, the worn-out fields, the rocky places and wooded areas that were not really well cultivated or able to be cultivated. And the landlords who had owned that land expected some kind of compensation even for giving that up, and so it became incumbent upon the government to pay the landlords for the land that would be given to the serfs. However, the serfs weren't given that land free and clear. They were going to have to pay for it. And since they had no money, very few of them could pay for it right away. That meant that the government held title on the land until the serf paid off the loan that had been issued by the government to them to own that land. In essence, the government held a mortgage owned by the serfs, which gave them rights to land. And they were given 49 years to pay off that mortgage with interest to the government. Until it was paid off, the serfs weren't really free. They couldn't go anywhere. They couldn't leave the land. They couldn't do anything until that debt had been paid off. In the meantime, they're debtors and they lose their rights. What we're really looking at is the fact that the Russians didn't want to give up control of the serfs. They didn't want to give up the tradition of serfdom. The aristocrats didn't want to give up the prestige that came with owning serfs. And since they couldn't literally own them, they controlled them other ways. They controlled them by creating this mortgage that denied them rights. They created them by creating local village councils that ran their affairs, because until they had paid off their loans, they weren't capable of governing themselves. The result, perhaps, is no surprise. Continued unrest in Russia as they attempted to put this plan into action. The serfs are unhappy. They don't think enough has been done. They're not really free, and they become increasingly unhappy over time when they are unable to make the payments on that loan and thus begin to lose land rights and other rights and find themselves in increasingly deep problems. The nobility, they're not happy either. They think too much has been done. They've lost that prestige and control and no longer own the serfs as they always had. The result is that Alexander II wasn't a very popular leader. And indeed, in 1881, Alexander was assassinated. A bomb was placed under his carriage, and he was killed by a group calling themselves the People's Will. His successors, Alexander III and then ultimately Nicholas II, became increasingly repressive as unrest continued. They expanded secret police, they expanded censorship of the press, they expanded the control over the rights and the lifestyles of the people living in Russia. Russian industrialization was being driven by political and military goals. The government forced it. There was no entrepreneurial push behind it, there was no popular support for it, and much to nobody's surprise, it didn't work very well. Industrialization in Russia was much slower. It was much less effective than you would find in places like Europe or the United States, and far more protest accompanied it. The serfs, they didn't really get out from under those mortgages and those obligations